My son-in-law stood at the head of my own kitchen table on Christmas morning and told me I had 30 days to get out. He didn't raise his voice. That was the part that stayed with me afterward. He said it the way you'd tell someone their parking meter was about to expire. Calm. Practical. Like he was doing me a favor by being so organized about it. I set down my coffee mug. I looked at my daughter. She was staring at the centerpiece I'd made the night before, pine cones and red ribbon, the same arrangement I'd done every December for 31 years. Nora, I said. She didn't look up. My name is Cecily Ann Woodward. I'm 64 years old, and that morning I understood something I should have understood a long time ago. The people who love you most can also be the ones most willing to let someone else take everything from you. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where things really started, because this didn't begin on Christmas morning. It began the day my husband died, and a man named Griffin Holt decided my grief made me easy. My husband Warren died on a Tuesday in March 3 years ago. He was 66, heart failure, the kind that comes with no warning, no dramatic symptoms, just a man sitting in his recliner watching the evening news, and then simply not watching anything anymore. Our neighbor found him when I didn't answer the phone for 2 days. I'd been visiting my sister in Asheville and couldn't get a flight home until Thursday. I had 32 years with Warren Woodward. He was a civil engineer for the county for most of that time, steady and methodical, the kind of man who balanced our checkbook by hand every month, even after online banking made it unnecessary. He said it kept him honest. That was Warren. He believed in doing things the long way because shortcuts had a cost he wasn't willing to pay. We had one daughter, Nora Lynn Woodward, now Nora Holt, 37 years old, with her father's stubborn chin and unfortunately very little of his patience. She was living in Charlotte when Warren died, working in pharmaceutical sales, married to Griffin for 2 years at that point. They drove up to Summerfield for the funeral and stayed the week. It was kind of them. I was grateful. What I didn't notice, in those first brutal weeks of grief, was how carefully Griffin watched the house. He walked every room. I thought he was just restless, the way men get at funerals when they don't know what to do with their hands. He asked about the neighborhood, the property taxes, the school districts. I thought he was making conversation. He asked about Warren's pension and whether I had enough to live on. So I thought he was being considerate. He was taking inventory. Nora called me every few days after they went back to Charlotte. She was worried about me being alone. The house was too big, she said. 4 bedrooms, a finished basement. The yard Warren had spent 20 years landscaping into something genuinely beautiful. Too much for one person to manage. Did I need help? Had I thought about what I wanted to do long term? I told her I wasn't ready to think about anything long term. I'd just buried my husband. She understood. She gave me space. For a few months, things were quiet. Then in September, 6 months after Warren died, Griffin lost his job. He was a regional director for a commercial real estate firm. The way Nora explained it, there was a restructuring, and his position was eliminated. It happened to a lot of people at that company, she said. It wasn't his fault. He was already talking to other firms. It would be temporary. That same month, they asked if they could move in with me. Just until Griffin finds something new, Nora said. Charlotte's expensive and my salary alone doesn't cover our mortgage, plus all the other expenses. 6 months, maybe 8. You have all this space, Mom. It would give us time to stabilize. I said yes. Of course I said yes. She was my daughter. Warren's death had left the house so quiet I could hear the refrigerator running from the bedroom, and truthfully, I was lonely in a way I hadn't expected. Not sad exactly, but hollowed out, like all the structure of my days had been built around someone who was no longer there to hold any of it up. They moved in on October 1st. Nora had 11 boxes of clothing. Griffin had 4, and he had opinions. More opinions than I'd realized in the 4 years I'd known him. Within 2 weeks, he'd suggested we move the dining table closer to the window. Within a month, he was making comments about my grocery choices. Cecily, have you considered switching to a whole food diet? Cecily, do you know how much sodium is in that? Cecily, the yard would look better without those flower beds along the fence. Those were Warren's flower beds. I'd planted them with him the summer of 2009. I let it go. He was going through a hard time. People under stress say things they don't mean. The 8 months became 12. 12 became 18. Griffin interviewed at several firms, he said, but nothing was the right fit. He was particular about the role and the culture. He had standards. In the meantime, Nora's income was covering their expenses. Car payments, credit cards, student loans. They weren't paying me anything for the house. I hadn't asked them to. They were my family. A year after they moved in, Griffin started a consulting business. At least, that's what he called it. He worked from Warren's old study, which he'd rearranged without asking, moving Warren's bookshelves to the garage to make room for a standing desk and a ring light. The business didn't seem to produce much income, but it gave him a reason to stay home all day, which meant he was always there, always present, always rearranging my life one small decision at a time. Nora got a promotion in the spring of their 2nd year with me. She started traveling more for work. She was good at her job, always had been, and I was proud of her. But it meant she was home less, which meant I was alone in my house with my son-in-law more than I'd ever expected to be. He started making suggestions about the house itself that 2nd year. The kitchen would be so much more functional with an open layout. Cecily, have you ever thought about finishing the sunroom? You know, if you listed this property right now, you could probably get close to 600,000, maybe more. The market's doing incredible things in this area. I would change the subject. He would find his way back. I should have paid closer attention to where he was going. Christmas morning, year 2, my sister Eleanor, the one who'd had me visiting in Asheville when Warren died, was supposed to arrive at noon. I'd been up since 5, making her recipe for cranberry walnut bread, the one our mother used to make, because the smell of it in the oven was one of the few things that still felt like Christmas without Warren in the house. Griffin came downstairs at 8. Nora was still asleep. He poured himself coffee and sat at the kitchen table and watched me work for a few minutes without saying anything. Then he set down his mug. He said he and Nora had been talking. He said they'd made a decision. He said it calmly, practically, like he'd rehearsed it in the shower. The house, he said, made more sense as a rental property at current market rates. He'd had it assessed without telling me. He said this without blinking. They were looking at somewhere between 4,200 and 4,800 a month. That was significant income. That was the kind of passive revenue that could fund their retirement and Nora's long-term security. Of course, for that to work, I would need to find somewhere else to live. He'd already looked into some options. There was a 55-plus community about 12 miles away, the Pines at Guilford, independent living, no nursing care required, very nice by all accounts, studio and 1-bedroom units available. Rent ran about $2,000 a month, which was very manageable given my Social Security and Warren's pension. 30 days was a reasonable timeline, he thought, given that he wanted to have the house listed by February. I stood there, holding a wooden spoon with cranberry juice on my hands. He said, I know it's a lot to take in, but Nora and I have really thought this through, and we think it's the right move for everyone. I looked at the doorway. Nora was standing there in her robe. She'd been awake. She'd heard all of it and said nothing. Nora, I said. She looked at the centerpiece. I put down the wooden spoon. I untied my apron. It was the blue one with tiny white stars that Warren had brought me back from a county conference in Raleigh one year, probably 2011. I don't remember why it stuck with me, but it did, and I folded it over the back of a chair. All right, I said. Griffin looked relieved. Nora still wasn't looking at me. I need to make a phone call, I said. Excuse me. I went upstairs, closed my bedroom door, and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time without moving. Outside the window, Warren's garden was bare and brown, the way it always looked in December, waiting. Then I started to laugh, quietly at first, and then not quietly at all, because Griffin Holt had made a very serious mistake. He thought I was just a widow, living in a house she couldn't manage on her own. He had no idea what Warren and I had built. Warren and I never talked about money in public. It wasn't something either of us was raised to do. My mother thought discussing finances was vulgar, and Warren's father had the same philosophy. We were private people. We drove sensible cars. We didn't take elaborate vacations. We shopped the sale when my co-workers at the school district. I worked 31 years as an administrative coordinator for Guilford County Schools. Would talk about their beach houses and their cruises. I'd smile and nod and not mention that every year, from our very first year of marriage, Warren and I had put away the maximum allowed into both our 401 cess and a separate brokerage account he managed quietly and carefully. Warren grew up watching his father lose everything in the late 80s. His father had been in commercial real estate and got over-leveraged and lost almost all of it by 1991. Warren was 19 when it happened, and it shaped him for life. He became the opposite of his father, conservative, patient, never carrying debt he didn't have to, never betting on growth he couldn't substantiate. For 32 years, we lived on 2/3 of what we earned. We bought the house in Summerfield in 1994 for $182,000 and paid it off in 2007, 15 years early. We drove cars until they had over 150,000 miles on them. I packed my lunch to work every day for 3 decades. We raised Nora without spoiling her. We said no often and explained why, and we saved. We always saved. I hadn't looked at our investment statements since Warren died. I'd filed them in his desk drawer where he'd always kept them, and the grief had made numbers feel meaningless. His financial advisor, a man named Preston Alcott, had been sending me quarterly reports that I'd put in a folder without opening. On Christmas morning, I opened the folder. The first statement was from Vanguard, account balance as of November 30th, $891,404. I stared at it. Then I kept reading. 5 Fondies IRE in my name. Joint brokerage account at T Ameritrades in $48,115. Warren's pension from the county $2,840 per month. Survivor's benefits transferred to me own benefit $1,620 per month. Savings account at First National $68,447. The house conservatively assessed at $580,000 based on the comparable sales Griffin had apparently researched without telling me. I sat in the chair at Warren's desk and added the numbers in my head 3 times because I kept not believing them. total liquid assets, not counting the house, just over $2.2 million. I thought about Griffin downstairs, explaining to me that I could afford a studio apartment on $2,000 a month. I thought about Nora looking at the centerpiece. I thought about Warren, who had lived for 32 years like a man who understood that quiet discipline was its own kind of power. I thought, Griffin, you have absolutely no idea who you're dealing with. I went back downstairs an hour later. Griffin was watching football in the living room. Nora was in the kitchen, finishing the cranberry bread I'd started. She handed me a slice without meeting my eyes. I'm going to need a few days to figure out my plans, I told her. Of course, she said. Her voice was flat. Take whatever time you need. I'll probably call Preston Alcott after the holiday. I watched her face when I said the name. Preston had been managing our accounts for nearly 20 years. Nora had met him at Warren's memorial. She knew who he was. Something shifted slightly in her expression. Sure, she said. That makes sense. I went back upstairs. My sister arrived at noon. I didn't tell her anything over Christmas dinner. I sat at my own table, in my own home, eating the food I'd made, and I watched Griffin Holt talk about real estate market projections and interest rates, and I was very, very quiet, because I'd started to remember something Warren always said. Don't let people see your hand, not because you're hiding anything dishonest, just because, if they know what you're holding, they'll tell you what your cards are worth, and they'll always tell you wrong. The day after Christmas, I called Preston. Cecily, he said when he picked up, warm and immediately concerned. Is everything all right? I need to understand exactly what I own and what rights I have to all of it, I said. There was a brief pause. Why don't you come in tomorrow? I'll be there at 9. I also called a man named Howard Quinlan, who was a real estate attorney Warren had used twice over the years. Once when we bought the house, and once when we did our estate planning in 2016. He was semi-retired, but Warren had always trusted him. When I told Howard what had happened, there was a long silence on the line. Then he said, Cecily, they can't do a single thing to you. Tell me why. Because your name is the only name on the deed. Warren always held that house in your name jointly, and when he passed, it transferred to you by right of survivorship. Nora is not on the deed. Griffin is not on the deed. They are guests who have been living in your home rent-free for 2 years, and guests you can legally ask to leave with 30 days written notice. I let that sit for a moment. What they're attempting, telling you that you need to vacate your own property, constitutes elder financial abuse under North Carolina law. It's a Class H felony, and if Griffin has been representing to any rental platform or real estate agent that he has authority over this property, that may constitute fraud. He had the property assessed, I said, without telling me. Howard made a sound I can only describe as an attorney suppressing the urge to swear. Did you authorize that assessment? No. Do you know which firm he used? I can find out. Good, find out. And Cecily, don't tell them you've talked to me. Not yet. I drove to Preston's office the morning of December 27th with Warren's folder of statements in my bag. Preston had known Warren since before I married him. He was the kind of financial advisor who sent handwritten notes for birthdays and remembered the names of your children. He met me at the door. We went through everything. 2 hours at a conference table with coffee that kept getting refilled by his assistant. At the end of it, Preston leaned back in his chair and looked at me over his glasses. You are one of the most financially secure women I know, he said. Warren made sure of it, And he made sure you'd have everything you needed to manage it yourself if it came to that. He never told me the full picture, I said. I let him handle it. You trusted him. That's different from being helpless. Preston paused. Did Griffin know any of this? About the accounts? I don't think so. And Nora? I thought about it. Nora knew we were comfortable, but Warren and I had never discussed specific numbers with her. It wasn't something we thought she needed to know. She had her own life to build. She doesn't know the numbers, I said. Preston nodded slowly. Then someone convinced himself he had the full picture when he only had a corner of it. I went home and I started going through Griffin's things. I'm not proud of that part. I want to be honest about it, but he'd been in Warren's study for 2 years with access to Warren's filing cabinets, and I needed to know what he'd seen and what he'd concluded. In the top drawer of Warren's desk, which Griffin had pushed to the back corner of the room to make space for his standing desk, I found my original copies of our estate documents, everything intact. But I also found something that hadn't been there before. A printed email exchange between Griffin and a property management company called Evergreen Residential Group. The email chain was dated November 14th, 6 weeks before Christmas morning. Griffin had contacted Evergreen about listing a rental property. He described the property, 4 bedrooms, finished basement, large yard, Summerfield neighborhood, and asked about average rental rates and vacancy rates for the area. The Evergreen rep had responded with market data and offered to schedule an in-home assessment. Griffin had scheduled it for December 10th. I checked the calendar on my phone. December 10th. I'd been at a book club meeting at the library that evening. I'd come home to find Griffin watching TV. He'd said he'd had a quiet night. Quiet, right. I photographed every page of that email chain with my phone. Then I kept looking. In the pocket of a blazer Griffin had hung on the back of Warren's desk chair, I found a folded printout of a Zillow estimate for our address. The estimated value was $592,000. Someone had written in pen in the margin, minus pro penem GM'd 8%, 4,048 ton, net est annual, 48,576. I stood in the middle of Warren's study, with that piece of paper in my hand, and I thought about the 2 years Griffin had spent in this room, sitting at my late husband's desk, using Warren's filing cabinet, walking the halls of our house like he was already calculating square footage. I thought about how Nora had looked at the centerpiece on Christmas morning instead of at me. I needed to know how long she'd known. I didn't ask her directly. I asked around the edges. That evening I said to her casually, over dinner, I found an old statement in Warren's desk. Preston says our accounts have grown pretty significantly since your dad passed. I should probably sit down with a financial planner and think through what I want to do long term. Nora looked up. Preston Alcott? Yes. How significantly, she said. The question landed a little too quickly, a little too specifically. If she hadn't known anything about our finances, the natural response would have been something like that's good or good idea, not how significantly. Enough that I'm not worried about the future, I said. She looked at Griffin. He was cutting his chicken. He didn't look up. Good, Nora said. That's good, Mom. But the look she and Griffin exchanged when they thought I was focused on my plate, that look told me everything I needed to know about how much she'd been involved in this plan. I called my sister Eleanor that night. I told her everything. Oh, honey, she said. Then she was quiet for a moment. What do you need me to do? Come back up after New Year's. I need a witness. I need someone who knows the truth. Done, she said. I'll cancel whatever I have. I spent the last week of December documenting everything quietly. I photographed the evergreen emails. I made copies of every financial statement. I printed a timeline. I wrote down every conversation I could remember. Dates, what was said, who was present. I dug out the assessment notice that had arrived in the mail in mid-December, which I'd assumed was routine until now. The assessment firm was called Piedmont Property Solutions. Howard checked them out. Licensed, legitimate. But Howard also confirmed that no one had called them to tell them the property owner had not authorized the assessment. They'd been told the homeowner was unavailable, but the family member coordinating the property had full authority, a family member with full authority. Griffin had told them that. Howard said that was going to be a problem for Griffin, not for me. New Year's came and went. Eleanor arrived January 3rd. I'd told Nora she was coming to visit. Nora smiled and said that was nice. On January 5th, I asked Nora and Griffin to sit down with me in the living room. I told them I'd been thinking about the transition and I wanted to discuss it properly, and that I'd invited my attorney and my financial advisor to join us at Howard's office the following morning. I wanted everyone to have the same information. Griffin's face didn't change. "That seems unnecessary," he said. "This is a family matter." "It's also a legal matter," I said. "Howard will help us make sure we're all on the same page." The next morning, we drove separately to Howard's office. It was in a brick building on Elm Street that had been there since the 1970s. Heavy mahogany furniture, framed degrees on the wall, the kind of office that made you feel like the law was actually solid and old. Preston was already there when we arrived, along with Howard and Howard's paralegal, a woman named Judith who had a legal pad and an expression of absolute neutrality. We sat. I was across the table from my daughter and my son-in-law. Eleanor sat beside me. Howard opened a folder. "Let's begin with the property," he said. "Nora, Griffin. On Christmas morning you informed Cecily that she needed to vacate this property within 30 days so that it could be rented out as income property. You indicated that this was within your legal rights. I'd like to address that." Griffin straightened his jacket. "We did research on the ownership structure. What did your research tell you?" "That the house was in Warren's name and that it would have passed to Nora through the estate." Howard paused. "Who told you that?" Griffin hesitated. "I looked at public records." "Did you look at the deed specifically?" "I looked at the tax records." "The tax records list the mailing address for the tax bill," Howard said. "They don't convey ownership structure. The deed is the controlling document. Let me show you the deed." He slid copies across the table. "This property at 1418 Larchmont Drive, Summerfield, North Carolina, was purchased on April 12, 1994, by Warren Thomas Woodward and Cecily Ann Woodward as joint tenants with right of survivorship. Upon Warren Woodward's death on March 8, his interest transferred automatically and completely to Cecily Ann Woodward. Cecily is the sole owner of this property. Nora is not on the deed. She has never been on the deed. You have no ownership interest or legal authority over this property whatsoever." The room was quiet. "Furthermore," Howard continued, "a licensed property assessment firm was contacted in December and told that a family member with full authority over the property had requested the assessment. That representation was false. Cecily did not authorize that assessment and was not informed of it. Misrepresenting authority over someone else's real property to a third party can constitute fraud." Griffin looked at Nora. Nora was looking at the deed. We didn't. Griffin started. "We're not finished," Howard said. Let me read you something from North Carolina General Statutes, Chapter 14, Article 6. A person commits elder abuse when they exploit a disabled or elder adult through the unauthorized taking, appropriation, or conversion of their property or financial resources. Cecily is 64 years old, demanding that she vacate her own property so that you can collect rental income from it constitutes attempted financial exploitation of an elder adult under North Carolina law. That is a Class H felony. Nora made a small sound. Preston leaned forward. He placed a single sheet of paper on the table. I'd also like to address the comment made on December 25th that Cecily could be comfortable on Social Security and a modest pension. As of November 30th, Cecily's liquid investment accounts total $2.2 million. This does not include the property at Larchmont Drive, Warren's pension benefit, or her Social Security income. Cecily is not financially vulnerable. She is, in fact, financially secure in a way that most people in this room will never be, and she achieved that security through 32 years of disciplined partnership with her husband. He looked at Griffin directly. Cecily never had a formal career title. She worked for the school district, yes, but her contribution to this family's wealth was what she and Warren decided together to do with every dollar he earned. She managed the household so carefully that they were able to save and invest more than most dual-income couples manage. Assuming she was helpless because she doesn't drive a luxury car or carry a designer bag was a profound miscalculation. Griffin's jaw was tight. Nora's eyes were wet. "There's one more thing," I said. It was the first time I'd spoken since we sat down, and my voice sounded steadier than I expected. I placed the photograph of the evergreen email chain on the table, then the Zillow printout with the handwritten margin notes. I found these in my late husband's study, the study Griffin has been using for 2 years. The email chain with Evergreen Residential Group is dated November 14th. The assessment from Piedmont Property Solutions was conducted December 10th. While I was at a library event. The Christmas morning conversation was not a spontaneous decision. It was the conclusion of a plan. I looked at my daughter. "Nora, I need you to tell me how long you knew." She didn't answer for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible. "He brought it up in October," she said. "He'd been talking about it since the summer. I told him I didn't want to do it. I told him twice," she paused, "but I didn't stop him. And on Christmas morning, I stood there." "You stood there," I repeated. "I'm sorry, Mom." I let the words sit. Howard handed Griffin a folded letter. "This is a formal notice that you and Nora are being asked to vacate the property at 1418 Larchmont Drive no later than February 5th. You are guests who have resided at this property rent-free for 26 months. You have no lease agreement and no legal standing to remain if the property owner requests that you leave. If you are present after February 5th, you may be removed by law enforcement for criminal trespass." Griffin's voice finally cracked. "You can't do this. We're family," I said, and I looked straight at him. "Family doesn't schedule property assessments behind your back. Family doesn't tell strangers they have legal authority over your home. Family doesn't hand you a 30-day notice on Christmas morning." I paused. "You are not my family. You are my daughter's husband, and right now that distinction matters." I stood up. "Nora, you have until February 5th. I'll be at Eleanor's until then. When I come home, I expect you both to be gone. You can leave the key on the kitchen counter." I walked to the door. I turned back once. "I'm not pressing charges," I said. "I want to be clear about that. I could, And Howard has told me I have a reasonable case. I'm choosing not to, because pressing charges against my daughter's husband would damage her life in ways that are not proportionate to what I'd gain. But if you ever attempt to represent authority over my property again, if you ever contact Preston or Howard or any financial institution in my name, if you ever approach me about money in any form, I will file and I will see it through. Do you understand? Griffin said nothing. Nora said yes. Eleanor drove me to her car in the parking garage without saying much. She put her hand over mine when we got on the highway. How do you feel? She asked. Strange, I said, like something very heavy just shifted. Good heavy or bad heavy? I looked out at the highway. January in North Carolina, bare trees, cold white sky, that particular stillness that comes before things start growing again. Both, I said. It's May now. I'm sitting on the back porch with a cup of coffee that's gone cold because I keep forgetting to drink it. Warren's garden is coming back. The rose bushes he planted along the fence are putting out new growth. Small green leaves, not open yet, but there. The yard doesn't look like much right now. Give it until June. Nora and Griffin moved out January 28th, a week early. She texted me when they were done, a short message. She said she was sorry. She said she needed time. I said I understood, and that I loved her, and that I'd be here when she was ready. I haven't heard from Griffin since the morning at Howard's office. In March, I got a card from Nora. Not a long letter, just a card, one of those simple ones without much printed inside, so there was space for her own words. She wrote that she'd started seeing a therapist. She wrote that she'd told the therapist what happened at Christmas. She wrote that she was ashamed she hadn't stopped it sooner. I put the card on the windowsill above the kitchen sink, where I can see it while I'm washing dishes. 2 weeks ago she called. We talked for 20 minutes. It was careful and a little stilted, and at the end she said, "I miss your cranberry bread. I said I'd make some this fall." She said she'd like that. I'm not healed from this. I want to be honest about that too. Some mornings I stand in the doorway of Warren's study and I can still feel Griffin's presence in there, the way he'd rearranged everything without asking, and I have to consciously put my own things back in order. I moved Warren's bookshelves back from the garage. His collected Steinbeck, the field guides to North Carolina birds, the worn copy of Walden that had been his since college, they're back where they belong. I learned something I'm still learning, even now. For 32 years, I built a life that was solid and quiet and mine, and then grief made me permeable. It opened up spaces in me that I hadn't meant to leave open, and someone walked through them and started rearranging the furniture. I don't blame myself for being lonely. I don't blame myself for wanting my daughter close, but I should have paid more attention to the difference between someone who wants to be near you and someone who wants to be near what's yours. Those are not the same thing, and they don't feel the same, not until it's almost too late. The coffee is cold. I'll go make another cup. The roses aren't open yet, but they will be. That's enough for now. That's more than enough.